Hello everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
Elaine, don't you realize that we can't keep living like this? The man asked, lifting his head. He's becoming a burden on us. The woman looked at him with a mix of defiance and guilt. Her soft features turned sorrowful, her hands restless, and her eyes avoided the man's intense gaze. But Charles, Arthur is still my husband, and he was once very good to us, she said. The man sighed, spreading his hands. Come on, you'll never be happy if you keep worrying and serving him. He's like a vegetable now, and you heard what the doctor said. He won't live past a year. So, what's the point? I think he should be somewhere fresh and comfortable, like the countryside, to recover. The good thing is that you'll have a substantial inheritance when he dies, and that can improve our situation. Elaine looked thoughtfully at Charles. The next day, all of Arthur's bags and belongings were packed. Charles placed them in the hallway, smiling at the sight of his confused friend. Arthur, a handsome man with brown hair, sat in a wheelchair. At 37, he had been struck down by a sudden stroke, leaving him disabled. He had lost not only his mobility but also his ability to speak. He almost always sat still in his wheelchair, silently enduring his condition. While Elaine went to work, Charles often came over to take her place in caring for his friend, and at times, it seemed as though Arthur felt that his wife purposely stayed late at work to avoid coming home to a helpless husband who couldn't even go to the bathroom on his own. It should be said that Charles had never been truly sincere with his friend. For a long time, Charles had harbored envy and resentment toward Arthur. Arthur had risen to become the deputy director of a major company. Following that, Charles's hatred for Arthur only grew. He frequently shouted at Arthur, unable to stand his silent requests, and he often disposed of Arthur's medication or lunch. The only thing that pleased Charles was Arthur's inability to talk, preventing him from stopping Charles from rehearsing lines from the plays he used to act in. As Elaine packed up items to load into the car, Arthur leaned against the doorway, watching the scene unfold with silent horror. His eyes were red and on the verge of tears. Don't worry, Charles smiled. Your doctor said you have a weak heart, and the fresh air in the countryside will be good for you. You might even survive the year. Don't you like that? A whirlwind of thoughts invaded Arthur's mind, but he couldn't express any of them. If he could, he would scream at his fake friend, exposing all his true thoughts about this despicable man. Dear Elaine, why are you doing this? Charles asked. I'm making sure Arthur has everything he needs so he won't lack anything, Elaine explained. Charles shook his head, casting a disapproving look at her. Do you think your dear husband is still going to the company to manage employees, that you need to prepare so much for him? Charles grumbled. Unexpectedly, a neighbor from the building stepped out. Good afternoon, Elaine, going somewhere? Charles quickly interrupted with a wide smile. We're taking Arthur to a good hospital for rehabilitation. The doctor said it'll help him. That must be expensive, right? The neighbor said, shaking his head. Yes, very costly, Elaine admitted. But I can't leave my husband untreated. He's done so much for us. After a brief exchange, the neighbor continued on his way. The kind smile and expression quickly disappeared from Charles's face as he turned to Elaine and frowned. Let's get going before the whole hallway knows our plan. We should have done this sooner. Elaine grabbed the suitcase and sighed. 20 minutes later, Arthur and all his belongings were finally loaded into the car. Elaine looked at her husband in his folded wheelchair in the back seat. Tears rolled down his eyes. Arthur, please calm down, she whispered gently. A servant will take care of you there. And of course, we'll be paying for it with your money, Charles interjected with a smirk. Elaine nodded. You know, our financial situation isn't great right now. So yes, we'll be using your money. You'll be better off there. Arthur stared at his wife with a determined gaze, searching for any sign of pity or hesitation in her pale face. Unfortunately, there was none. The car left Elaine and Arthur's home precisely at noon. Elaine tried not to look in the rearview mirror, where she could see her husband's swollen, tear-filled eyes. "Arthur, you have to understand, I have no other choice," she murmured. All she saw was her husband's sorrowful face. "Charles is just trying to improve our situation. He's right, I can't take care of you all the time. I still have my youth, and Charles can't come over every day to care for you either. So, you'll be better off there, with a private nurse." Elaine fell silent again, avoiding her husband's gaze, though she could feel his eyes on her back, as if they were burning through her thin coat and pressing directly on her lungs, making her breathe faster. The drive to the village where Arthur would live was long. That remote village was nearly deserted, with only a few houses, a small shop in the center, and an old clinic that had closed years ago due to a lack of staff. The black car passed a small house with a messy garden and a broken-down fence. The house itself was decent enough from the outside. The garden was overgrown, with thick grass that, in some places, was higher than the fence. An old bench lay in front of the window, and someone was lying on it. As Elaine and Charles helped him out of the car and arranged his wheelchair and belongings, Arthur stared at the figure on the bench, a man who rose and approached the door. His face was hollow, hair disheveled, and he had an old bruise under one eye. Evan wore completely mismatched clothes that were unsuitable for the weather and brown shoes. "Early, huh?" Evan said. Elaine frowned and turned to her husband. "This is your nurse, Arthur. His name is Evan, and he'll be taking care of you from now on," Elaine said. To confirm her words, Evan nodded with a cold expression. Charles unloaded all the suitcases from the car and even carried them inside. Then he handed Evan a thin envelope, clearly with not much money inside. Afterward, he stood in front of his friend. "Arthur, why the long face? I'm sure you're smiling on the inside. This is a wonderful place for your recovery," he said, glancing around at the abandoned land and the broken door. "Fresh air, constant care, what more could you want for happiness?" Arthur could think of a million things that would make him happy, but as usual, he remained silent. He glared at his wife, each look filled with more thoughts than words could ever convey. Elaine understood this and even felt a slight pang of regret, but then Charles's words and the number in Arthur's bank account flashed in her mind, extinguishing the regret and filling her with anticipation for her husband's money. Elaine got into the car and waved at her husband through the window. Evan approached Arthur and greeted him. "Don't worry, Arthur, everything will be fine," Elaine said, trying to muster an awkward smile before the car pulled away, leaving Arthur alone with the abandoned house and a gambling addict who was supposed to care for him. A year later, Elaine had never visited her husband. Charles glanced at the calendar and exclaimed in horror. "A whole year. Elaine, you're such a fool. How do you even know if he's dead by now or, worse, still alive?" Elaine stood up from her vanity and looked at Charles tiredly. She had just returned from a night out with friends and suddenly realized she had never checked on her husband. Charles was shocked and indignant. "Evan calls me every week, everything's fine. I send money quarterly." "Calm down, Charles," Elaine said. Charles took a deep breath and walked over to the vanity where Elaine was seated. He snatched the brush she was using and threw it aside. "When I speak, you look at me," he said loudly, his tone theatrical. "Evan, who is he?" "Just a gambling addict you left to care for your husband." "Are you certain he's caring for Arthur and not blowing all the money on gambling? Maybe he hasn't checked on Arthur in a long time, while you're here preening yourself." Elaine squinted at him wearily. "Do you want me to go check on him tomorrow?" "Fine, I'll spend tomorrow going to that backward village to visit my half-dead husband." Charles sighed and left the room. The next morning, Elaine packed a few things, grabbed an envelope of cash, and took a taxi. She figured Charles's worries were unfounded, but she'd become accustomed to following his lead on most matters. The ride was long, the radio was broken, and the driver's silence made the morning even more unpleasant. Elaine vaguely remembered the road to the house where she had left Arthur. She usually gave money to Evan in the city, where he would take a bus to receive the envelope. Elaine had only been to that village twice, once when she left her disabled husband there and a second time when she hired a caregiver. Unexpectedly, Elaine stopped the car beside a nearly new fence. The grass in the yard had been cut but had grown back, as if it had been trimmed months ago. Elaine frowned and stepped out of the car, carefully opening the gate and calling for her husband or Evan, but no one answered. Elaine tried to go inside, but the door was locked. She attempted to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Frustrated, she pulled out her cell phone and called Evan, but there was no response. Annoyed, she rubbed her forehead and looked around. Now Charles's doubts didn't seem so baseless. Though she knew Evan was untrustworthy, she knew his house was near Arthur's, so she left her car and walked down the street. Within 10 minutes, she found the right house. Her concern grew as she saw Evan's house in even worse condition than her husband's. Entering, she was hit by a foul stench that made her cover her nose in disgust. Evan was sitting with a group of gamblers, looking no better than him. Elaine quickly dragged him outside. "Where's Arthur?" Elaine demanded angrily. "Who?" he brazenly replied, slurring his words. "My husband, you gambler." "Oh, Arthur. He doesn't live far from here." "Take me there," Elaine said. They walked along a deserted road for some time, and Elaine grew increasingly astonished as they approached the house. Compared to the other homes in the village, this house was large, with 3 stories, a balcony, and a spacious garden. Evan stopped a short distance from the iron gates of the house and pointed forward. "He lives there now," he nodded, then quickly left without saying another word. Elaine was stunned by what she saw but quickly regained her composure and rang a small bell. A cheerful voice responded. "Kara, you're early." Elaine froze for a moment, whispering, "Arthur?" The voice on the other end paused before replying. "Elaine, come in." As the door opened, Elaine was greeted by a vast garden and a stone pathway lined with lush flowers. She carefully walked down the path and entered the house. On the steps stood a tall, dashing man with brown hair. She looked him up and down, his face betraying no emotion. "I thought you'd never come," he smiled. "But come in now that you're here." Elaine was speechless as she followed her husband through a beautifully decorated home, soothing colors, tasteful decor, clean paintings, and carpets. She glanced at her husband, who looked even more handsome than before his stroke. His sharp face was healthy, and his eyes held a dangerous edge she'd never seen before. Arthur led her into a spacious living room with sofas and armchairs. "I'll make some tea, and then we can talk," he said before leaving to make tea, leaving Elaine alone in the living room. She sat in an armchair, unable to take her eyes off the room's beauty. She even pinched herself to confirm it was real. She couldn't believe she'd expected to see her husband weak and confined to a wheelchair, only to be greeted by a new, confident presence she'd never experienced. A few minutes later, Arthur returned with a large tray bearing several teacups. He handed his wife a cup and took one for himself, carefully sitting across from her. "You didn't expect this," he murmured. The woman remained silent. "I also didn't expect my dear wife to send me off to die for money and for another man," Arthur continued. "I know everything, my dear. You're not very good at hiding the truth. It was all about my inheritance. When I received my father's will from France, I was thrilled, imagining the life we could have together. But then, I discovered something that changed my thinking. Do you remember my personal assistant, Dex? The one we used to work with?" Elaine nodded. "He's the one who encouraged me to make a few changes a couple of years back, tall and polite." Dex sat across from Arthur in a restaurant. Arthur smiled, sitting comfortably. Then he opened his small bag, took out an envelope, and handed it to his close assistant. "Look at this. Do you think it's real?" Dex opened the envelope with excitement and read the letter. It was a letter from France. Who's Gavy? My biological father, Arthur replied. My father married a French woman, and they moved to live there. Then, my father suggested I move to live with him, but I couldn't go because I had a woman I loved here, Elaine. Dex looked at his boss, bewildered. You really can't change, Arthur. You missed a great opportunity to live an exciting life in France for the sake of a selfish woman. Arthur was well aware of his assistant's opinions of his wife and didn't want to hear them. Dex had always been very blunt, which was why he had a successful career but few friends due to his direct personality. You know, Elaine would be willing to sell her own family for money. Do you know how much your father left you? There's a letter with instructions, Arthur replied. My father wrote that I am his only living relative and will inherit part of his assets, while the rest goes to the children of his wife. According to the letter, there's a substantial sum of money and a portion of the property in France. Do you need to go there to claim it? Dex asked. There are instructions in the letter. I can accept the inheritance here, a notary will come directly to me, Arthur said. I can imagine. Elaine has always dreamed of wealth, Dex said, twirling his fork. But unlike her, you have the skills and intelligence to run a business. Don't speak of Elaine that way. She's a good person, she's just had bad luck, Arthur said. Dex laughed. Yes, but I look into her eyes and always see greed and disloyalty. I just want you to be cautious. Arthur shrugged. You've worked with me a long time, but you still can't understand my wife as I do. Dex sighed in frustration and took a sip of his drink. Thank you for watching the video all the way through. You are our biggest motivation to keep creating. Let us know where you're watching from so we can see how far this video has reached around the world. Don't forget to hit like if you found it interesting, and share it with your friends too. I advise you not to mention the inheritance to your wife, or she'll bury you for it, or worse, start charming her way into taking every penny. Arthur slapped his hand on the table and glared at his employee. Elaine and I are in love, that would never happen. You have such a terrible view of my family. Dex smiled but changed the subject. Later, Arthur shared the news of his inheritance with his family and close friend. Everyone was thrilled. Charles even opened a pricey bottle of wine to celebrate, and Arthur felt Dex had been entirely mistaken. A few weeks later, Arthur decided to surprise Elaine with flowers and jewelry. He returned home unannounced, expecting her to be delighted by the gesture. Stepping in quietly, Arthur peeked through a door and saw the most horrifying sight of his life, his wife in a passionate embrace with another man, none other than his longtime friend, Charles. Arthur staggered back, leaning against the wall for support. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Rather than making a scene, Arthur returned to his office, processing what had happened. The next morning, he went to a local detective agency. A short man with glasses sat at a small desk, reading a newspaper and drinking coffee. Arthur sat across from him, explaining the situation. I want to know everything, how they met, where they sleep, what they do, where they go. I want it all. For a week, Arthur lived in a state of uncertainty, not daring to tell Dex for fear of hearing, I told you so. But he had to admit, Dex had been right. Dex had always seen through Elaine. Now, Arthur began to understand his assistant, who only wanted what was best for him. Half a month later, Arthur received a call from the detective and soon found himself sitting across from him. You know, you're lucky your wife's lover is quite the talker, the detective said with a smile. I had to tail him for nearly 2 weeks, interview his friends, but I got everything. With a wide grin, the detective pulled a bulky, old-fashioned tape recorder from his desk drawer. The man pressed play, and a recording began. Charles. Don't you miss me? Why haven't you come by for days? Elaine's voice echoed. Of course I miss you, darling, but my work isn't going well. I have to put in more hours to raise capital for my new business, Charles complained. I wish I had enough money for my business so I could spend more time with you. You love me a lot, don't you, Elaine? Will you help me? I know you have a way to help me, Charles continued. I wouldn't spare any money for you, Elaine replied gleefully. Once you start your own business, I'll support you. How exactly will you help me? Charles prodded intentionally. Arthur swore Elaine had laughed. Not me, but my husband will. Elaine was 4 years younger than Arthur. They met when he was already working for a big company with a generous salary. He invited her to a cozy cafe, took her to the park under the stars, and bought theater and concert tickets. With her beauty and her talent for feigning innocence, Elaine stole Arthur's heart. Dex objected, but Arthur wouldn't listen, too captivated by Elaine. Memories flooded Arthur's mind, the time he and Elaine picked out their wedding attire and the gifts they arranged after the ceremony. He felt pure happiness then, convinced he'd always feel that way. Although Elaine showed little interest in his career dreams, wanting instead to settle down with a family and avoid the chase for ambition, Arthur wasn't ready for that. He wanted more. Now, every dream and hope of a shared life had collapsed in an instant. Arthur sat there, staring at the wall for minutes on end. The detective stayed silent, having seen many different reactions in his line of work, including husbands who had once stormed out, smashing windows in rage at their wives. Arthur stood up to get a drink of water. He took a deep gulp and recalled Dex's words, that Elaine would sell everything for money. He hadn't believed it then, but now it seemed true. In the mind of the betrayed husband, a plan began to take shape, a dark smile forming on his face. The detective pulled back, never having seen such an expression on a man's face. Months later, Elaine's black car pulled away from the dilapidated gate where she had left a disabled Arthur. As soon as the car was out of sight, Arthur stood up from the wheelchair. Evan's eyes widened as the man he'd been paid to care for suddenly rose after his supposed stroke. Evan, let's make a deal. I'll pay you as much as my wife did, and you won't say a word about what you've seen, Arthur proposed. Evan nodded, dumbfounded, too stunned to ask anything. Good, we'll be good friends. Here's your first payment, Arthur said, handing him some cash. You come by each month, and I'll pay you. In return, you keep reporting to my wife that my condition hasn't changed and she doesn't need to visit. Understood? The man nodded, pocketing the money and leaving without a word. Arthur went inside to change his clothes. Inside the old house, everything was covered in dust. The furniture was draped in sheets, litter was scattered around, and a window was broken, likely from kids trying to break in. Arthur approached the old red couch, removed the sheet covering it, and sat down, a cloud of dust rising around him. He took out a phone Charles had failed to find and dialed the one number he trusted. Come over. Everything happened just as you said. I'm waiting for you. Setting the phone aside, Arthur leaned his head back. His mind was flooded with thoughts, thinking about everything and nothing all at once. 2 hours later, after Arthur had cleaned up the house a bit, the door opened and Dex walked in, carrying a small bag with wine and takeout. For a celebration, Dex said with a smile. Thank goodness you brought wine. I can't handle today otherwise. I still can't believe they left me here to die, believing in hasty diagnoses. It's baffling. They thought I wouldn't live long and started celebrating without considering the reality of my prognosis from the doctor, Arthur said. The two began eating, contemplating their next moves. I'll stay here a month or two until I figure out what to do. For the first time in my life, I have no plans, Arthur said. What will you do here? Dex asked. An abandoned house, a messy garden, an isolated village. You don't fit in a place like this. If I throw myself into the chaos now, I'll have a mental breakdown. I'll live here to regain my peace. Besides, it's been ages since I took a vacation, Arthur explained. Dex shrugged. For once, he didn't know what to say. From the start, he hadn't liked Elaine, though he hadn't known why. Dex stayed over that night with his boss, heading back the next morning. Arthur had left his job, but Dex hadn't. Arthur started his day with a cold shower to clear his mind of overwhelming thoughts. 3 weeks of living in misery had passed. He had tried to test his wife, hoping for some show of care or affection from her, but all he got was bitterness and her wish for his quick death. One day, Arthur fell seriously ill, his body aching, and he was feverish. He couldn't reach Evan and didn't want to call Dex to come from far away. His violent coughing attracted the attention of a neighbor, Kara, who, after hearing his persistent coughing, decided to check if something was wrong. "Excuse me, is anyone home?" Kara called. Hearing no response after a few calls, Kara decided to step inside. She opened the door and was shocked to see a pale man, feeling his forehead and noting his high fever. "Hey! Are you alright?" Kara asked, rushing out to buy food and medicine from the nearest shop. When she returned, she immediately gave Arthur something to eat and drink. She stayed by his side for hours until Arthur finally woke up. "You're awake. You scared me. You had a high fever and passed out. Where's your family? Why are you here alone in such a dangerous state?" Kara asked urgently. "Thank you so much. I didn't think I was this sick," Arthur replied weakly. "I have no family. They abandoned me to live alone because I'm just an invalid," Arthur continued. Kara looked at Arthur with a compassionate expression. "I'm Kara, I live next door to you. I don't know what happened with your family, but being alone is really dangerous. If you ever need help, just come to me or my parents, they're both very kind," Kara said. Arthur thanked her. From that moment, Kara frequently visited Arthur, afraid the man might fall ill again but too shy to ask for help. To Kara, Arthur seemed like a pitiful, poor man who often got sick. She had no idea that he was actually a successful man with a large inheritance. As time went on, Kara continued to treat her poor neighbor kindly, and Arthur saw in her a genuine kindness free of social distinctions. Arthur fell in love with Kara, and she, too, found her initial pity growing into love. She wanted to care for him every day and hated to see him live alone. They quickly became a couple, and Arthur shared the entire story with her, surprising her by buying a beautiful house nearby just for them. Meanwhile, Elaine couldn't believe the story she'd just heard. She placed her hands on her knees, staring straight ahead, bewildered. "You made up all of this just to test me?" Arthur looked at her sadly and took a sip of tea. There was a knock at the door, and Dex entered, looking straight at Elaine and smiling. "So, you've told her everything." "Too bad I missed her expression, came a bit late for that." "So, you knew all about this," Elaine growled. Dex chuckled. "That was the doctor I paid to give the diagnosis. Did you really think Arthur would do all of this alone? He loved you too much to act this way, but you shattered his heart and decided you could treat him like trash." Elaine pressed her lips together. "You don't understand. Arthur, I love you." Arthur raised an eyebrow with a smirk. "So, is Charles no longer enough for you? Or is he just tired of waiting for you to fund his business?" Elaine opened her mouth to argue but stopped, realizing any excuse would be pointless. "How dare you play this game on us?" she asked. "Charles was devastated to hear you were sick." Dex and Arthur exchanged a look and burst out laughing. Charles was the first to cheer at the news that his best friend was ill and dying. He was even more interested in Arthur's inheritance than you were. Elaine looked around the house and then smiled broadly. "So, you bought and secured all of this while we were still married," she said. Dex, who was not only Arthur's assistant but also a lawyer, immediately understood what she was implying and wanted to counter it, but Elaine continued. "Since you acquired all this while we were still married, half of it belongs to me, correct?" Dex, knowing the legal complexities, saw where this was heading. Arthur stood up and glared at his wife, wanting to tell her everything he thought of her. At that moment, the door opened, and Kara stepped in. "Hello, darling." Arthur nodded and whispered something into Kara's ear. "My love, this is my husband, do you understand?" Elaine shouted jealously, lunging toward Kara and pulling her hair. Arthur, stern and furious, seemed unstoppable as he approached Elaine and slapped her hard across the face. Elaine swallowed nervously, backing away, searching for an escape. "If you decide to threaten Kara, I'll make your life a living hell," Arthur said harshly, pushing Elaine out of the house. Dex, Arthur, and Kara heard the main door slam as Elaine left the house quickly. "Do you feel better now?" Arthur asked, holding Kara tightly in his strong, reassuring arms. "Tomorrow, I'll file for divorce." Elaine then filed her own divorce papers, seeking half of the assets. The notice arrived by mail, and Kara delivered it, along with other documents, to Arthur with a serious look. When Arthur opened the envelope and read the court summons, his face turned pale. He hadn't thought Elaine would actually take him to court over the assets, but he also hadn't thought she would abandon him to die. Elaine was indeed unpredictable. "We need a good lawyer," Arthur said as he held the notice. "Dex," Arthur said. "He runs the company's legal department and is licensed to handle cases. I think he can help us." Arthur sat down next to Kara and said, "Listen, yesterday, after you left the bathroom, I found a pregnancy test. Are you pregnant?" Kara nodded and said, "I didn't know how to tell you. I thought you'd care." A gentle kiss interrupted her words as he embraced Kara, beaming. "Thank you, Kara. I'm so happy." Kara's bright smile and sparkling eyes said it all. She hugged him tightly. "If Elaine decides to take half of what you own, I don't mind. We may lose everything, but we'll have a home, our child, and each other." Arthur closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened them, Kara saw a resolute and unyielding look, the same one that had once intimidated the detective. "If she goes to court to take what's mine, she'll walk away with nothing. I'll take not only what's rightfully mine but everything she owns. She'll be left with nothing." The court hearing came quickly, as if fate itself wanted to resolve this bizarre situation as soon as possible. The judge's gavel ended it all. Elaine and Charles glared at Arthur with anger and hatred as he held Kara close. Dex joined them, grinning broadly. "I told you we'd get it all back," he said, his tone strangely possessive. "That's what belongs to you." Kara smiled. "Only one thing's missing, a baby to make it complete." Dex packed up the documents. "Then it's good," Kara said, placing a hand on her stomach. Dex laughed. "Quite soon. Am I going to be the godfather? Do we have a choice?" Kara asked. "No," Arthur laughed, hugging the two most important people in his life once more. Now, he was sure everything had turned out right.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.